Welcome back to another Python tutorial. All right, so today we are going to go over, what are we going over today? Dates. We're going to talk about dates. So this is actually kind of kicking off like a little mini series, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. So we're just going to talk about the datetime module in, well, the datetime library inside of the Python standard library. So this is one type of library where a lot of us use this on a very consistent basis. And there's actually a lot to it. And you'd be surprised how sometimes simple operations can be very complex if you don't know what object you're working with and understanding how you sometimes need to set up that object in order to perform that certain operation. So just keep that in mind. It's deceiving. It looks simple, but there's actually sometimes where things can get, a little bit complex if you're not careful. So actually, before we begin, I was reading a little article on CNBC because I guess, Bank of America came out and said like, hey, recession because, the whole COVID-19 and all this. And I started reading it and, it was interesting because, I looked at their, I guess like at least the highlights of the article, they're saying by second quarter, the GDP basically is going to contract 12%. I'm like, good Lord. I mean, that's insane. I don't think, at least post Great Depression, I can't think of anything that's been that dramatic of a contraction. But then it's interesting because then they're saying basically for the full year, they're thinking a contraction of maybe a little under 1%, which is, it's interesting because basically what you would be saying is like either in the third and fourth quarter, you are going to be doing some dramatic climbs up. So it's just interesting, this would freak anybody out. But then when you look at it from the annual perspective, that's not nearly as bad as, a 12% contraction. So I don't know. That's kind of interesting. And then they're talking about the number of jobs lost. And then they were talking about the unemployment rate. And it was interesting because I think they were talking it potentially, nearly double. And last I checked, I'm pretty sure the unemployment rate, and it's so hard to tell now, unemployment rate, US, okay, so they're basically saying we're probably going to get up to 7%, if that's basically right. So again, not horrible. It's not the 20% that Mnuchin was talking about the other day. It's definitely not great, but, will be kind of interesting though, too, is, where is that unemployment focus? Is it very broad or is it industry specific? So, a lot of interesting stuff, obviously, from an economic perspective. All right, so back to our video because that's why you're watching this. How do we work with the date object? Well, it's very simple because most time, anytime you're working with this, dates or times or time zones or time deltas, you're using the datetime library. And so what you do is you say from datetime import, and then there's all these different basically objects. One is date, one is time, one is time zone, one is time delta, and then one is date time. So there's really kind of like 5 main components, but there's actually like subclasses within each one of these. But generally speaking, you can do almost everything you need to using these basically like 5 main objects, right? So these are kind of like our data types and our, time delta, date time, and stuff like that, right? So anytime you're working with date time, you want to make sure first you're importing it correctly because, for example, this is where things get a little bit messy. I can import time. The problem is I need to now give this one an alias because am I talking about this one or am I talking about the one that I imported from datetime? They're not the same. They're not the same. You would think they're the same. They're not the same. So just be a little bit careful when you're working in between different types of modules that are related to datetime, because if you do not import them correctly, your code won't run. And it's very confusing sometimes because it's like, well, is it this one or is it that one? Like, which one has the sleep method in XYZ? So normally, if I'm importing the module as a whole, I will give it some type of alias, right? So if I'm gonna say import time, I'll just say as T or something that way I can distinguish the one that I'm working with versus the one that I'm working with inside the actual, inside the actual datetime module. Now, we've imported our date object. How do we construct a basic date? So let's construct a basic date. So what I can do is I'll create a new variable. I'll call it my date, and I'll use my date constructor. And my date constructor basically takes 3 arguments. One is the year, which is the year representation. So I'll do 2020. One is a month, which is an integer, which also represents the month. In this case, I want it to be March. And then finally, I have a day. So the day can be the particular day that I want to represent. In this case, I want March 1st, 2020. So now, if I print my date, I can say, here is my date. And then I'll say my date, and then I will do dot format. And then I will do my date equals my date. So now if I run this, might be kind of hard to see, but you can see my date. All right, let's keep going. Now, it's important to know you can always go backwards. So you have a date object and you might at some point want to say, what's the year? What's the month? What's the day? You can always go backwards. So for example, if I wanted to, I can take my date object and I will notice that there are certain attributes about it. So there's this day one. So if I look down and I look at it, I can see it's a date. So it's basically the day. I have a month and I have a year. So if I want just the year component, I would do my date and then period year. If I want just the month, it would be just the month attribute. If I want just the day, it would be the day attribute. So if I print out each one of these, I will now see each individual component. And then, what is it? Type. Let's see what the type is. It's just an integer. So now you're getting down to one of the more basic data types. Okay, so that's getting the individual components. I can also take an existing date and I can replace a component of it. So for example, replace the year. So I can say my new date is going to equal my old date. I'm going to call that replace method, and then I need to specify what I want to replace. I can specify just one part. So I can say, you know what? Hey, I just want to replace just the year. So that's change my year. Or if I wanted to, I could replace every single component. So I could say, hey, I want the year to be that. I want the month to now be April. And then I want the day to be 20. So for 2021. All right. And then that's replacing a different component of that year. Sometimes we want to either get a string representation, or we might want to ask certain questions about my particular date object. So this is where I think this library shines, is it does all those operations for you. So for example, maybe I want the weekday, right? So print my date, and then there's a weekday method. This returns an integer between 0 and 6, where 0 is Monday and 6 is Sunday. So return the weekday. 0 is Monday. 6 is Sunday. So in this case, it is a Sunday. Is that right? It is right. Wonderful. Yes. And then, most of us don't live on a 0 to 6 calendar. There is an ISO weekday. So now Monday will be 1, Sunday will be 7. And so in this case, this will be 1, this will be 7. You can see it's now 7. Okay, and then we're going to start talking about string representations of a particular, date object. Now, some of these I'm more familiar with than other ones, but bear with me. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Gregorian. I think that's how you pronounce it. Maybe it's not. But basically, this returns the Gregorian date. And so if I do print my date and I say to ordinal, returns the proleptic Gregorian ordinal for the year, month, and day. January 1 of year 1 is day 1. Okay. Well, we'll see in a sec. So there's that one. To be honest, I maybe it's like the number of days. Yeah, number of days maybe from year 1, if I had to guess. Then there is my date. There's a C time. This one's kind of neat. This one returns, it's like the string representation, includes the day, the month, and then the year and the time. If there was time, well, right now there's no time. So, it's not going to be there. Sorry. My voice is going out, I think, a little bit. Okay. So that's C time. Let's talk about ISO format. So ISO format, it's kind of self-explanatory because they now give it to you, but it's basically year, month, date. And so a lot of times you'll be working with applications and they usually want it in this type of format. In fact, if you actually print it, that's what the default one is. So in this case, it usually returns the ISO format. And so this tends to be the more standard one that you work with in different types of applications because is usually what they're asking for. Additionally, there is a ISO calendar one. So that's kind of an interesting one too. So there's ISO calendar. This one returns a tuple, which contains the year, the week number, and the weekday. So this one's kind of, and they kind of tell you up here. So the year, the week number, and the weekday. And it's a tuple. So in this case, the year, the week, and then the actual day. So in this case, and also keep in mind too, because we're on ISO, it's going to use the ISO weekday. And because this is a Sunday, it's going to be 7. So that's kind of neat too. And then additionally, we have my date, and then there is a time tuple. So this one returns the local time tuple. Now in this case, it's kind of pointless in a sense because I don't actually have a time associated with it. But if you look at it, it does have the year, it does have the month, the day. If there was an hour, there'd be an hour, a minute, a second, a weekday, a year day, and then is daylight savings time. I think I'm trying to remember. Well, I don't know exactly how that one's determined in the sense like automatically if it's determined or if it's something where by default it will basically give it to you. But regardless, at this point, just keep in mind if you use time tool, it basically gives you everything. So it basically gives you the hour, the minute, the second, the weekday, the year, like the number of days, starting from 1 to 365 and stuff like that. So that's kind of nice having this kind of capability where you can take it and you can put it into a tuple format. And then there's also just a few other things that I do want to mention. So for example, sometimes we want the current date, so we can basically use today. So we want the current date, just use today. And so we'll call this today is, we'll take our date object and then we'll do today. And then from here, we can print it today is. And we can now see that we get today's date. So that's kind of nice too. If you need just, the current date, that's always the nice things to have. And then additionally, just two final things. There are special properties inside the date module. One is min. So the min is basically the earliest possible date you can create. And then we have the opposite, which is max. And so here, the date we can create, the latest possible date we can create. So if you want, you can go back to year 1, month 1, and day 1, or you can go to the year 9,999, December 31st. So again, I don't know where you would necessarily want that per se. Sometimes you need like a starting point and then you need to subtract. In those situations, I'll kind of explain that down the road and kind of how we can do that. But really for a date, that's pretty much it. So here again, grab the different parts and then replace a certain part or all parts. This is more representation, so string representation, but in some cases, returning, I would say, all the parts, if you want to think of it like that. So that's kind of how I like to think about it, but you can obviously tell, like even something as basic as a date, there's a lot of operations you can do with it. And then this is really just constructing it and, just very basic manipulations. We haven't talked anything where it comes to subtracting dates and stuff like that, Now, again, that's really its own topic, but, just constructing date and understanding what you have access to can be very useful, and understanding, what that looks like from, a coding perspective or stuff like that. So if at this point you have any questions, by all means, put them down in the comments below. I was going to do a third video, but I don't think my voice is going to let me. So if you have any questions, by all means, put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video.